Okay, what are the principles of Druidism?
One of the interesting things about Druidism is that there are certain key ideas that you find within Druidry. There's no sacred text, there's no authority in Druidry. Druidry is something that's been expressed, Druidry or Druidism is something that's been expressed over the years by different people in different ways. But there are certain themes, I'd say more than principles, you would say there are certain themes that recur throughout people's discussions on Druidism. And one theme is, of course, the reverence for the earth, a love of nature, and a belief in nature as fundamentally a manifestation of spirit, if you like. So that there's no separation between matter and spirit, they're just all one part of the goddess or god or spirit. Many Druids believe in reincarnation, for instance. There's certainly a belief in a continuity of life after death in some form or another. But all the details are left to individuals to embellish and to hold on to or to not hold on to as they feel free.
Hey, how do Druids see other people's faith? Other faiths, how do they view that?
You know, one of the difficulties in talking about Druidry is when there's a question like how do Druids see other faiths, because every Druid will perhaps see it differently. So I can't hold forth on what other Druids might or might not think. So I can only speak personally, really. But I think there's a sense in which, because many Druids that I know certainly have come from a broad church, if you like, and they are inspired by many faiths often. I mean, a typical Druid might be inspired by Sufi poetry, they might sometimes do yoga, they might do Tai Chi, but somehow Druidry represents a spiritual path to them that feeds their souls, but it's not exclusivist in that sense. And I think this is a great task for us now in the world, is how can we on the one hand be true to our faith or what we feel is our religious or spiritual path, and yet at the same time recognize that all paths are expressing qualities of truth and the divine.
Are there people that practice Druidism from various different faiths then?
Yes, you find that there are Druids who are Christian Druids, for instance. And it's interesting, some will call themselves Christian Druids and some will call themselves Druid Christians. And I did a couple of surveys on the internet to see, because it was my intuition that a lot of people were informed by at least two faiths, and I found about 70% of people who responded to these surveys said that two religious approaches fed them as opposed to just one. So there's quite a lot of people who are inspired by both Christianity and Druidry. So we have a whole section on our website that deals with that and offers resources and books and links and so on. But there are also quite a few people who find themselves nourished by Wicca and Druidry. So these two strands that feed them. And again, you will some people who call themselves Wiccan Druids and others who call themselves Druid Wiccans. And then there are people who are actually inspired by the Dharmic religions, either Buddhism or Hinduism or Jainism. And somehow they find that meshes very well with their Druidry. And that may be explained by a historical link, the fact that if you follow the Indo-European theory of origins, we had a sort of common origin somewhere in sort of southern central Europe or the Caucasus or something like that, and then peoples moved left and right, west and east, ending up with the religions and cultures of India and of the northwestern Europe. There are all sorts of linguistic parallels and so on. And so there are quite a lot of people who are inspired by Buddhism and Druidry, and Jainism and Druidry, and Hinduism and Druidry.
How do you think other faiths, when you talk to other faiths, do you feel that Druids are sometimes seen as different to other faiths in any way? Do you feel that they are accepting to people that are Druids?
Well, the story of Druidry, because it's more recent, because what happened is that Druidism was originally a practice that was all but wiped out, by the 6th or 7th century when Christianity had spread all across Europe. And then was revived again, and interest reappeared in the 17th and 18th centuries. So you had this long gap. And so you have this Druidism that we have now that in one sense is only 300 years old from that period. But in another sense has its roots much deeper in the pre-Christian past. And what's tended to happen until probably the last 20 years is people have been a bit snooty about that. And I've heard remarks like, well, it's not a real religion, is it? Because it was reinvented in the 18th century. Now, over the last 20 years, people's perception has started to change. And people have started to see that it does have some validity. There are, after all, religious movements that are very recent, and 300 years is actually quite a pedigree already. So once we get over our obsession with lineage and authenticity and start to look instead at what a spirituality is trying to do and what value it has in the world, if it's doing any good, then I think we get closer to the heart of things and to asking meaningful questions. And so what we've seen with Druidry over the years is it's shifted from, I mean, when I was a kid, when I was young, say in the sort of 70s, Druidry was on the real fringes of all sort of alternative spirituality. So you would have movements like, say, theosophy or anthroposophy that would be sort of more established, and then Druidry was right on the edges. And gradually this process of moving from the edge to the centre has occurred. So Druidry more and more is becoming a sort of an accepted part of the religious scene. And so I get invited to interfaith gatherings, and I was at a tree planting interfaith sort of grove of peace that we planted in the Forest of Dean a few months ago, and so on. So gradually it's becoming more and more accepted, I think.
What are your hopes for the interfaith movement?
Well, I think from the little exposure I've had to the interfaith movement, I think it has a great deal of value, because it's always important that people communicate with each other and share their perspectives and stories. However, at the moment, I think there is some limitation in as much as everybody's sharing their perspective from their perspective and then isn't perhaps shifting away from that. And that's absolutely fair enough as it is. But I always feel a little frustrated because I sense something else growing, if you like. I sense another dynamic in place in society at large, as it were, which is a dynamic towards synthesis, towards breaking out of the boxes that labels create, of respecting traditions and paths, but also respecting the fact that in its essence spirituality has no label, has no doesn't need to be put in any box. That we're all human beings on this planet circling through space, and to confine ourselves is perhaps doing a disservice to ourselves and our potential, and to the nature of divinity, which is bigger than any human label. And so I think the interfaith movement seems to me a good starting point, with a lot of potential, but there's a long way to go to kind of open it out and to allow a kind of creative synthesis to occur.
How would you recommend that synthesis should come about?
Perhaps in a way, I think, with movements that are natural, there's probably a way in which you can't control it and direct it. I see it outside of the interfaith movement. I just see it in the world. Locally down the road, we will celebrate with Christians and Druids and pagans and Wiccans and Buddhists and agnostics, and go up onto a hillside at the solstice and welcome the dawn. And there's this tremendous feeling of sort of community and a kind of common humanity and a common spiritual focus that doesn't have a label to it. And I suspect you can't really direct that. I see it happening. And maybe it's more about the interfaith movement just being sensitive to it and open to it and allowing whatever happens to happen without trying to control it.
So that's one of the things that set me going on it.
Thank you very much.
When you talk about Druidism and Christianity, often we think about what Christianity and Druidism is today. You're looking at links going back over 2,000 years,
Yeah.
back even to 5,000 years ago. How much has Christianity changed and Druidism changed? Clearly, are we talking about the Druids that are around in today's world, or are we talking about an ancient wisdom that was lost and may not be the same as Druidism today? And are we saying the same with Christianity? And was the purpose of the film actually trying to suggest that Christianity, Druidism, ancient Greek philosophy, Brahmanism from India and stuff like that, actually was one and the same? It was just a search for this esoteric knowledge. And are we saying that today's world is actually trying to do the same thing, that all of these isms isn't really important? But has Christianity and Druidism changed? And we were talking about the same Christianity and Druidism and Jesus today as we are today?
No, we're not. One can certainly watch the evolution of Christian theology quite closely, because that's been well recorded in writing, and one can look at the sorts of debates that were going on in the 1st, 2nd and 3rd centuries, the different traditions that started out Gnosticism and so on, which didn't then get encouragement and so on. And you got to the point, and in the 4th century under Constantine, after his conversion, or his political decision that Christianity should be the unifying religion of the Roman Empire, if you like, he brought the Christians, the warring Christians, together at the Council of Nicaea and knocked their heads together and said, we'll come up with something that you can all agree with. And then we've seen the way in which Christianity has evolved from that. I'm not discounting, as some Christians would, the movement of the Holy Spirit within the churches and the tradition, but one's seen the way in which churches have gone, changed, evolved. And if you look at the church now and look at the church of the 1st century, based on Essene community life and so on, they are miles apart. In terms of Druidism, it's very difficult to know whether there is any link at all. And this is controversial, I know, within certain areas, but it can be argued that Druidism as it is today is a revival religion, almost a reinvention of Druidism, picking up on a lot of clues, but actually no discernible continuum from one to the other over 2,000 years. But let us suppose that one has got some sort of idea of where the two came from. We do from Christianity. One can suppose from some of the clues of where Druidism came from. I think one can then look back 2,000 years ago and see a web of interlinking ideas between the wisdom knowledge, the Druidism, the Greek thinkers, the Jewish thinkers, the Essenes, and so on. Not that there was a formal structure, but there was a very strong interlinking pattern of ideas and an exchange of ideas between those groups, which of course have gone off in different directions. Essenes no longer survive, and the Jewish tradition has gone off in a particular way through the diaspora, different traditions having to leave Israel and so on, or the Holy Land, and Christianity evolving, being established through the Church of Rome, splits there, Druidism having to be almost reinvented from clues in order to be able to satisfy a need for a religion that touched upon the spirituality of the created world. I don't know whether that answers the question, because it's a fairly complex area, but I think one is, perhaps today, through some of Gordon's thinking, rediscovering some of the networks that were there 2,000 years ago.
And is it saying, are those networks relevant to today's society, or has it evolved and have we moved on? Have we got the age of reason, which has sort of come in and maybe continues? We kind of compartmentalise the idea of that reason and romanticism as the 17th, 18th century. But I mean, have we got to the stage now with our reason in the 21st century and the advent of technology where all of that actually becomes irrelevant and, we can actually reason things away with science?
No, because reason and logic were very important skills, cerebral skills to the Greek culture. But what I think we can learn is from what has been lost, and that is that when you are exploring scientifically, as the Pythagorean tradition did, the natural world, the mathematics of the movements of the heavens and so on, you can also symbolically connect what you are discovering mathematically with spiritual values. Now, a little bit of that, tiny little bit of that has survived in that, unlucky 13 and things like that. We've got a little bit of that left, but very, very little of it. And what we've done is split very sharply between the scientific world and the world of religion and theology. I like to sort of think about it, in terms of science addressing the how questions. How does this work? How does this happen? And theologians addressing the why does it happen? And what's the purpose of it? And I think what the ancient world was doing, through those various different interlinked traditions, was somehow seeing whether you could ask how and why at the same time. And I think that's something which perhaps we can learn from.
Is there a possibility that one of the wise men was a Druid?
There's a possibility that one of the wise men
Is there?
Was very much influenced by Pythagorean mathematics, particularly that route which came to the Essenes through Babylon, and certainly very interested in astrology. They were the Magi. The Magi were Middle Eastern. They saw the Bible indicates that they came from the opposite direction from the the lands of the Druids. Whether they were influenced indirectly is a possibility, but I don't think there's any evidence that the Magi were. They were, as far as I know, based in the area of around Babylon and Persia, that sort of area. But I don't know whether there's ever been discovered any direct or any discernible link, more than that they were interested in astrology, probably in mathematics, and if that was the case, then it would have possibly come through the Pythagorean connection through into Babylon and so on, because there was that interlinking of culture.
Is there any evidence that ancient Druid wisdom in the far north filtered into the Mediterranean world, to Egypt, in a way was one of the kind of forerunners of the great period of Greek thought? In other words, behind Pythagoras, there are the Druid and the northern wisdom.
This is where I feel I'm a very inadequate substitute for Gordon, because I think this is very much more his area. The Druids, as I understand it, took up the wisdom or rediscovered it for themselves. Now, the builders of Stonehenge were not the Druids. The Druids came later. They were the custodians of an even earlier wisdom, an earlier wisdom which I'm sure would have spread. One could argue that that wisdom had come actually not from Britain but much earlier, had come from further east. There are linguistic traditional or linguistic connections between India and the Celtic languages. If you think, for instance, of Punjab, land of the 5 rivers, and then you think of what Welsh for 5 rivers is, which is Pump-Aber, P-U-M-P-A-B-E-R, you've got an interesting linguistic coincidence there. So did the earlier wisdom actually come over from further east and move? We don't know, and I think there's a huge amount still to be discovered.
Can you tell me what you got from today?
Yeah, I thought it was a really full aesthetic experience, linking, nature and the faith and touching on life. I found it huge and holy, a very holy, healing experience. Yeah.
No, I was just going to ask you. You hosted here today this interesting talk about Jesus and Druids and potential esoteric knowledge. What do you think that the people of the current interfaith movement, whether they be Christians or Druids or Islam, Muslim, etc., have to learn from this sort of ancient knowledge that we were exposed to today?
I think, actually this is something crucial that I've been talking with them about. We are too mindset upon affirmation and creeds and formulas. And I do believe that we have a commonality in creation. And I quoted Philip Newell, who we met years ago, who came over on the weekend here on Celtic Theology. And he said something very beautiful. He said, when God stops speaking, creation will cease. And I think that we're looking to find ourselves and our identities in these creeds and formulas and, you know, expressions of division, rather than seeing ourselves as part of the creation of the creator of where we are. So I think if we stop looking at the things that are dividing us, we will actually begin to see the things that are uniting us in our commonality in creation with God who has created us all.
Do you feel that 2,000 years ago, the Essenes and people who lived at that period of time, whether they be Druids or Christians or were trying to actually get to that type of basis without the isms? And do you think that society is trying to do that again now? And what are its obstacles?
I think there are, but I think the trouble is that we have identified the isms with political foundations, with linear foundations, if you like, rather than vertical foundations. And I think when we can get away from that, we might find that we will have a little bit more common with our 2,000-year-old ancestors who were looking for that common wisdom. And we've got it. We've got it. We just need to let it live, let it grow, let it breathe, so that people can actually feel uninhibited and welcome that inclusiveness, actually, of cultures and creeds, etc.
And how can we encourage that?
Well, that's something I think we chaps are particularly at fault, you know, and I take this on myself. You know, we need to have things handleable and controllable so that we can still stay in charge. And it's a scary thing to let go and say, come on, let's see where people can find themselves in the environment of our spiritual milieu that we're in at the moment. Because in the end, we probably want to say, yes, but I am. You know, and it's scary to actually say, well, I am, but it's okay if someone else is there as well, but not actually saying what I am saying and expressing it differently to the way I'm expressing it. And I do think that we do need to encourage people to breathe, you know. And that's very difficult. That really is difficult for fellas in my position anyway. Okay?
And just out of interest, do you think the interfaith movement itself is actually having success in that, or are we just a talking shop that really still want to hold to our isms?
No, I'm really encouraged by the interfaith movement. Okay, it may not be huge, it may not be, you know, making enormous, thunderous strides, but you know, I'm suspicious of those enormous, thunderous strides. I prefer the quiet, sort of cellular action that's going on, and out of that cell, you know, if you look at the people who were here tonight, there will be people of, e.g. my community, who I know will come up to me and say, when are we going to do so-and-so about? And that's the way it works, and that's the influence. And that is something I believe in, that what it's doing is saying, great, be who you are, celebrate who you are, but don't exclude those who are not who you are. And that's what I think the interfaith group does. I don't think we're ever going to get to the stage where there is nothing but an interfaith platform. We will always have our identity issues, if you like. But that's okay, so long as we celebrate it and not ghettoize it. In other words, make ourselves into a, you know, into an environment which has its moat and its walls and its drawbridges and so on, and say, this is only where we're going to exist, and those who exist outside this, actually, they don't exist.